everyone.
It's time for another episode of What We Read, where we talk about some of our recent-ish reads.
Recent-ish.
I'm going to kick things off by talking about a non-fiction read. This was recommended to me by Kristen from Merrily Kristen. I think she might have read it last year and not this year, but the book is Save Me the Plums, My Gourmet Memoir, which is by Ruth Reichel. This is the cover. Basically, this memoir includes Ruth Reichel reminiscing about her life and her lifelong love affair with food and writing about food, and it specifically covers, or mostly covers, her time as the editor-in-chief of Gourmet magazine. I knew nothing about this author and her career prior to picking up this book. I knew nothing at all, but her life and experiences are so interesting that I felt like drawn into her story, regardless of the fact that she was basically a stranger to me. As someone who enjoys both food and writing, it was kind of fun to see that combined in a book. I thought it was just interesting because it was sort of like a behind-the-scenes look at what being in the magazine industry is like, or what writing as a career is like, writing for publications anyway. She does a lot of restaurant reviews and stuff like that early on in the book, so I thought that was super interesting. This memoir is broken up into different essays, basically, which are like the chapters in the book, and I found that some were more compelling than others for me personally. There were some where I really make myself pay attention consciously, and then there were some where I was like, I could not stop listening to it, because I actually listened to the audiobook of this one. It was an interesting look at a fascinating person's life and career, and I do think that if you are a fan of, let's say, Gourmet magazine, if you're familiar with this personality, if you want to read something that sort of focuses on a person whose career is centered about food writing and magazines in New York City, then you might want to check this one out.
Awesome.
The next book I read is actually also a recommendation from Kristen.
Ha.
Shocking. I did not think about that until I saw what book it was, and that is This Is Our Story by Ashley Elston, which I think Kristen actually might have gifted to me. I can't remember when, though. Kate Marino's internship with Mr. Stone puts her right at the forefront in helping solve one of the biggest cases in their town, which is the mystery of what really happened at River Point when a boy is murdered on a hunting trip, and the 4 friends he was with say they have no idea who did it. Elston's story is really well crafted. It immediately engaged my attention from the start, and it challenged me sort of to put the pieces of the mystery together for myself as we sort of get details revealed. And that was also very frustrating because I was like, I don't know how this makes any sense. I really don't. The most masterful thing about this novel is that she captures this small town atmosphere and also has these unreliable characters in every sense of the word. Like, you don't know who's telling the truth, and you eventually find out that a lot of them are lying about certain things. And it's really interesting because it just plays more into the mystery part of the story. Although it also has the effect of making me feel more detached and separated from the characters, which isn't always my cup of tea. The ending and the resolution were pretty satisfying, even though the way it plays out on the page is actually more rushed than I would have liked. There are obviously content warnings for this book because, you know, murder, drugs, alcohol, gun violence, extortion, blackmail, non-consensual photography. It's a lot, really. But it was a really interesting, it was a really interesting read. I can see why Kristen loves it so much, and I do think it's very clever for what it is. The next book that I read, and I'm going to talk about in this video, is a book that actually surprised me this year because I ended up liking it way more than I anticipated.
Ooh, a little bit more.
And it's a book called A Psalm for the Wild Built, which is by Becky Chambers. In this book, a non-binary tea monk has a personal journey of self-discovery, and that journey ends up basically disrupted by the arrival of a robot who has been sent to check on the humans and to find out the answer to a question: what do people really need? There isn't really much action in this plot. It's a very slice of life story, but it felt warm and cozy and sort of intimate, and it felt a little bit like a science fiction fairy tale, which is a vibe apparently that I really enjoy. Because it's a slice of life story, it's very meandering. Like the pace is sort of meandering because there's a lot of moments of reflection and conversation. There's a question and answer sort of dynamic that develops between the monk and the robot, and it feels almost like, as the reader, you're invited to like sit and stay a while with these characters, come along on their journey. It's a really nice, again, warm and cozy sort of thing. I really enjoyed the world too. There's like this juxtaposition between really modern scientific stuff and also very simple, basic human stuff. And also between like an urban lifestyle and living in the wild. And the details that the author incorporated really made it come alive. So I quite enjoyed that one, and I'm looking forward to the next book in that series because I think it will be fascinating to see what's happening with our monk and our robot. The next book I'm going to talk about is going to be my last before I let Mackie take over for a bit, and this is also a book that really surprised me, and the book is Light from Uncommon Stars, which is by Raika Aoki. So this is a genre-blending novel that brings together 3 unlikely individuals: a transgender violinist searching for a place to belong, a woman dubbed the Queen of Hell who has successfully delivered her contracted 6 souls and requires 1 more before her deal is complete,
Cool.
and an alien family fleeing a galactic war who are running a donut shop in California.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So it's a very
Correct.
interesting mix of elements here. It sounds almost like they would be discordant, really, because they kind of all have like different directions they're going, but this author, I don't know how they really wove all of that together in a way that made complete and total sense and read
Very
really
cool.
organic. The only thing that makes this reading experience a little bit more difficult is that some of the characters go through very traumatic experiences in the
Right.
story, but ultimately it sort of also has the opposing sort of feel where the author is trying to drive home this sense of safety and comfort and finding the place where you belong. It's nice because you sort of feel comforted at the same time that the character is also getting comforted in the story. The writing is a little bit dry for me. Like, I didn't necessarily enjoy that as much as I wanted to, but I did really care about these characters and what would happen to them. And so that's what really sucked me into the novel as well. I really wanted all of them to like get what they wanted or
Yeah.
needed. And it was like hard for me to imagine like how they would even get to that resolution at any point. So it was really surprising how much I ended up really liking this book. Again, content warnings for this one. There's physical parental abuse, mild racist comments, sexual assault, lack of or kind of dubious consent, suicidal thoughts, dead naming and misgendering, homophobic and transphobic commentary and acts, weapon violence, mentions of war, and cutting. So a lot of heavy stuff in this book. Oh, and one more thing that I forget to mention, obviously I like the donut aspect, but music is actually a very big part of this story, and I really like how the author chose to weave that into this one. So definitely a surprise how much I ended up really liking Light from Uncommon Stars, and I would recommend checking it out with the caveat that, of course, check out those content warnings as well. All right, your turn.
Awesome. Again, graphic novel binge. That's sort of like where I live these days. I'm gonna start off with Champions Volume 1, Outlawed by Eve L. Ewing. And in the Marvel Universe, there are always a bunch of new up-and-coming superheroes, roughly aged like, what, 14 to like 16, right? There's always that. And then they age out and do a bunch of other things and become parts of different teams.
Yes, yes.
The current group of youngins is led by Kamala Khan. Yeah.
Love it.
Little Miss Marvel herself.
I love this fangirl.
Oh no, totally. So Kamala's there. At one point in time, time-displaced Cyclops joins them. Scott Summers at age, like, what, 14, 15? Like, which is super cool. And then you've got Nova and a bunch of other...
That's
Miles
pretty cool,
Morales, actually, is also part of the same Miles. We love Miles. Some weird kind of superhero registration act version for teenagers gets enacted in the States. Therefore dubbing all teen superheroes vigilantes, and therefore you can't, sit with us, blah blah blah, say the Avengers.
I like how you can't.
And you'll be arrested and detained and put in like a rehab facility just to make you a better citizen. So it's not great, right? The champions are on the loose and they're hiding from things. I recommend this for any Champions fans. You'll see, Kamala, I want to say at her lowest, in that the whole world is against her. She just recently recovered from a terrible accident or injury, and now she wakes up to like a world in chaos where they're not heroes anymore. They're lawbreakers just because of the signing of the law. So that was nice. I liked it. That was cool. I also read Black Widow by Kelly Thompson, Ties That Bind. That's like volume 1 of Kelly's run. You think Natasha's sort of like living some kind of like double life for like some kind of op where she's like an architect and she's blonde and married to like and there's a child, until you realize 2 things. That is her biological child. And she has no bloody clue who else she is except for the nice little architect lady that she... So Clint, everybody else, they're like, what the hell is going on? So again, I feel like, in the vein of movies like Salt, like meaning that Angelina Jolie sort of like thing, Atomic Blonde, right? In the vein of like movies like that where, The Long Kiss Goodnight, right? Where somebody realizes that someone is messing with me big time. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. What a brutal, heartbreaking, amazing story where Natasha has to just like, what just happened to me? Why is this child mine? Which is ridiculous because we all know about the whole hysterectomies in the Red Room, that kind of deal. Gripping stuff. Which leads me to something, I was about to say lighter. No, not really. Just flashier. just flashy, because while with The Ties That Bind, we see Natasha sort of like get to the very core, like scratch all of that Red Room and avenging and privateering. Who is Natasha Romanoff at the core? Well, we have that gritty kind of story. The entire Jason Aaron's run of The Mighty Thor,
Okay.
focusing on Jane Foster, Thor's ex-girlfriend on Earth, and seeing her run from sort of like the midpoint or maybe the start all the way to the very end when she sort of like, you know, literally says, I can't do this anymore. Not so much of her own fault, but because she has cancer. The heroism, I want to say that goes with that. I really love Jason Aaron's run, I gotta say. It took a while. It went all over the place. Some crazy visuals, some crazy, like it went so many really insane places that I feel like anyone who wants to give Thor, not Lady Thor, not Girl Thor, you know what I mean? Thor, like, because whosoever is worthy, therefore possesses the powers of Thor. And Jane did pick that hammer up and said, me. I'm worthy. I'm Thor. And it was great. I never had any issues in the first place. But after reading everything, I'm like, come on, how can you not love that? So I highly recommend it to anybody who wants a fresh version of the Thor lore. I know. And if anyone is ever a Jane Foster fan, this is your book. This is your series, because this is Jane at her finest. So, on that note, I am done.
The next book I'm going to mention is one that Mackie picked for me to read and then eventually told me that I should hold off on reading the next 2 books in the series. Cushiel's Chyenne?
Yes.
Chyenne by Jacqueline Carey. This is the first book in the next trilogy that is set in the same world as the Cushiel series. The summary and the main character mentioning it is going to kind of spoil the original trilogy, so if you don't want to know anything, you can just skip to the next timestamp in this video. But after an incredibly traumatizing childhood, Imriel de la Courcelle is now officially a Prince of the Blood who must navigate court politics, including many attempts against his life, and his own inner turmoil about his character and his bloodline. Unfortunately, unlike the Cushiel trilogy, every single book in that one I kind of sped through, and this one, it actually took me much longer to read than I anticipated. Yeah. There's something about the way this one is paced that felt a little choppy and irregular, and that definitely did not help with keeping my attention on the page. That said, it also is partly because I find Imriel, who I loved in the original trilogy, I find him frustrating as a protagonist. He's a very different protagonist from Phaedra, and it's unfair to compare them, obviously, but it's hard not to, because that's why I love the first trilogy so much. Yeah. I loved Phaedra so much. Whereas in this series, I was like, Imriel is making poor, reckless life choices again, and he's doing that teenager thing where he's like denying everything and running away from his problems, and I'm just like, this is very difficult for me to watch you do. It is satisfying, though, to see who he becomes and what he decides at the end of this book, and that ultimately made the entirety of this story worth it. The other thing is that it's just nice to be back in a world that's familiar, very much changed after the events of the first trilogy, but still very familiar. You get to see a lot of familiar faces, and honestly, those moments and encounters really just gave me so many feelings, and I think that was also a big part of what kept me going with the story as well, because I was just like, who else is going to show up, and what else is going to happen, and what other connections are there going to be, whether it's a new one or something that, you know, calls back to what happens in Phaedra's trilogies. Ultimately, I still liked reading this one, even though it took me longer, and I do intend to continue on with the series, except that I'm just going to wait for a while until, you know, a better time to do so presents itself. The next and last 2 series that I'm going to talk about, they're all by Jennifer L. Armentrout, and the 2 series are actually connected.
Ooh, that's right.
The first series is the Covenant series, which begins with Half-Blood. Then it continues on with Pure. Then that continues on with Deity. And then it goes to Apollyon and Sentinel. So these are the stunning covers. I love these versions of the books. They're very pretty. Anyway, this series is her Greek mythology inspired series. The entire story is basically about a half-blood named Alex, and she finds her way back to the Covenant, which is like an organization for people who are, you know, touched by the gods or born as purebloods or half-bloods. And after she ends up going back to the Covenant after her mother is murdered by demons, and she's determined to prove that she can still become a Sentinel, which is one of like the defensive force of this organization, even if she has to undergo rigorous catch-up training, especially even if it's under pureblood Aiden, who also happens to be a former crush of hers. With this series, it's really a case of the right time and right place, because I had actually tried to start the series in 2020, And because 2020 was the year that it was, I just don't think I was in the right place for it at that time. So I thought the first book was good, but it ultimately didn't have me going like, I need to keep going, I need to keep reading the rest of it. And then I read it this time and I was like, I was mistaken. I don't know what I was thinking because this is amazing and it's actually great. It's just so fascinating to me the way Jennifer L. Armentrout draws on Greek myth to inform the story and how she weaves it into the modern day. Just imagine a YA version and a very unique take on the Greek myths the way that Rick Riordan does his middle grade series. It's kind of like that, except with teenagers.
Same energy.
Same energy.
Same transformative energy.
I think it's actually, as someone who has read Rick Riordan's work, I do still think this actually feels unique compared to it, and I thought that, you know, the way she did it was definitely one of my favorite parts of that series. I do think that there's a lot of predictability in it. Like, honestly, if you've read enough books, you can probably guess the twists and the turns. In fact, I feel like some of it you already know it's coming from the very beginning. But I do think that the thing that makes this series so great is that the characters, the cast of characters is incredible. I do think some of them are very young and teenagers, so they do make reckless, poor choices and also are very driven by their emotional impulses.
Of course.
But because I love them so much, I was so invested in the outcome of their story and what would go on with them. So I ended up absolutely loving the series, much like my friend Rachel predicted I would years ago when she first told me to read it. I'm so glad that I was able to finish the series this year because it was so good. I will say the finale book, the way things wrap up is so quick. It's so quick. And like, that is the one thing that I was like, okay, I guess that's just how we're gonna roll. Which leads me to the next series, and it is the Titan series, which is a spin-off. It's a new adult spin-off from the Covenant series, and it features a character from that series as the hero. So the books are The Return, The Power, The Struggle, and The Prophecy. So in this spin-off series, the main character is Seth, who you do meet in the Covenant series. He's assigned the task of retrieving and watching over Josie until he can get her safely to one of the Covenant schools, only to discover that there is a bigger conflict brewing that could decimate the entire world as they both know it. Overall, I don't think this series is quite as strong as the Covenant series. The pacing was a little bit janky at the start and the end of the series, and the plot was even more predictable and definitely over the top in this one. But I did enjoy getting Seth's perspective and seeing how his story would play out, and it was also cool to meet Josie, who is a very different protagonist from Alex in the first series, and it helped sort of reframe the world and the lore in a different light, which I thought was an interesting thing to do. Right. The best parts of this series are the same thing as the Covenant. It's really her incorporation of Greek myth into the modern day, and to have this, you know, sprawling cast of characters, some old and familiar faces, some new and lovable faces as well, just join the cast and, you know, to watch whatever befalls them or comes into their path. And it was just wonderful to experience that with them. I was glad I was able to read both of those series this year, and I look forward to reading more of JLA's books because apparently she has so many that I still haven't gotten to. But that brings us to the end of this particular What We Read video. Correct. We hope you enjoyed hearing us ramble on about books and graphic novels and comics. And if you have any thoughts on the books we mentioned, feel free to leave a comment down below. We hope you're well, and we'll see you guys with a new video soon. Bye!